Paris Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. And today I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Peter Hicks, who's an historian and international relations officer with the Fondation Napoleon here in Paris. Now, this week marks the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. That's the tightly fought engagement between a resurgent Napoleon Bonaparte and the British-led coalition forces under the command of the Duke of Wellington and Prussian troops led by General Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher. And as we all know, the outcome went in their favour, and the coalition forces won the battle, putting a decisive end to Napoleon's grip on power in Europe. Peter, it's great to have you back on the programme again. We had promised that we would meet up for this. It's the 206th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo. Before we get into the battle itself, and we won't go too much into the nitty-gritty unless we have a running screen behind us showing all the strategies and moves like on a board game. Let's just have a quick recap. March 1815, Napoleon leaves Elba, not necessarily escapes. He leaves.
Yes, that's right. It's February, 28th
It's
of February.
February, yes, and then he arrives in France.
Exactly.
In March of that year, returning to France to seize the throne from the Bourbon King Louis XVIII.
Who just left it.
Who had just left it. Exactly, with the coffee still warm.
The coffee still warm.
Now, let's just have a quick look. At the beginning of 1815, the Council of Vienna had already declared Napoleon an outlaw.
But not entirely. I don't think they'd already declared him an outlaw. They were meeting. They were sitting.
They
absolutely.
didn't make declarations easily,
no,
I'm sure.
No. What happened was they learnt of the news that Napoleon had left Elba. And at that point, they declared him an outlaw. But then the Congress finished.
Yes.
Before Waterloo. And so if you imagine that this Congress that was set up to organise Europe for the rest of time, they'd already come to their conclusion before the battle.
Yes. And indeed, the battle itself, which is an interesting thing. When we read about this battle, I mean, Napoleon, he'd already, it was his last chance to kind of maintain his hold on power, was to basically engage with the Allied forces north of the border before they came down on top of him. Is that right? Was his hand forced?
That's correct. Yes, absolutely. Well, basically, given the Congress of Vienna had finished, Napoleon was now proclaimed a perturber of the universe. So the Allies were present. The Russians were arriving from the north. And Napoleon, as usual, goes on the attack. He doesn't ever do defence. He thinks attack is the best form of defence. And so he heads north to attempt to split the Allied armies, the Prussians and the English, British Allied forces, because it's not just British forces, of course. There are Dutch and also the King's German Legion. You might want to consider that. I mean, they weren't actually very German, but they did have relationships with the Hanover, which was a possession of the King of England at that time.
And initially, Napoleon's forces were successful when they first engaged with the Prussians and then with the British-led forces. So just give us a little recap about exactly what the step-by-step process was bringing him up to Waterloo.
Absolutely. So we have on the 16th of June, you have a double battle. Napoleon splits his army in two, sends one off towards the Prussians, hoping to push them further east.
Of course,
further to separate them from the agreement that Wellington and Blücher had. So he tries to force the Prussians off, and this is a battle at Ligny, which is a French success. In the aftermath of Ligny, Napoleon famously sends Grouchy, as we say in French, off in pursuit of these Prussians. And the key element in this battle, Ligny, is that the Prussians don't go further east. They pull back west to stay in contact with the British coalition forces, which was part of the plan that Blücher and Waterloo had set up. Wellington, sorry.
Yes.
So that's Ligny on the 16th of June. Also on the 16th of June, there is a battle between the French and the British forces at Quatre Bras. So this is Quatre Bras, as you can imagine. It means four arms. It's basically a crossroads. It's a crossroads. And so they fight at this crossroads. Basically, you could imagine that Quatre Bras is also a French victory because Wellington pulls back his troops, meets Blücher on the day, and they agree to pull back. And so Wellington pulls back to his position, carefully prepared at Mont Saint-Jean, as the French call it, or Waterloo.
Yes, Mont Saint-Jean. Now, this is an escarpment, if you want to use the geological term. So, like it's a ridge, and this very much gave Wellington literally the upper hand advantage. Was Napoleon not fazed by, I mean, it has been said by historians such as yourself, like that even a seasoned, grizzled general come emperor and fighting man as Napoleon was, even that should have made him think twice and saying, right, he definitely has the upper hand.
Well, interestingly enough, Napoleon criticises Wellington's position at Waterloo. He says he's setting himself up with his back to a forest. That's catastrophic. You know, he's liable to be pinned down. And if you look at the way the Battle of Waterloo takes place on the 18th, as a day of battement between the 16th and the 18th, the way the battle takes place, Wellington decides to defend. Part of the plan. I defend until the Prussians arrive. So Wellington does what he did in Spain. He sits and takes it. But Napoleon thinks, if I attack and I drive him into the woods, he's stuffed. And it must be remembered that Wellington had also prepared his retreat.
Yes.
So there was a line that went from Waterloo all the way to Bruges.
To Bruges.
And so the British troops could be whisked away on boats so as to avoid being captured by the victorious French, should that have happened.
And indeed, there's a famous anecdote that he ate his breakfast on a silver plate in one of the houses that he had stayed in overnight after these victories, and was kind of, scoffing at Wellington's prowess as a general. So, I mean, was that just a perfect example of hubris on Napoleon's part?
Well, I don't know about hubris. I think if we look at the two careers of the two great generals, they're great generals. Wellington, of course, is extremely successful. He has extremely successful early period in India, where he learns his trade, and then though there are defeats in Spain, the final campaign in 1813 is quite glorious for Wellington. Yeah. He manages to outflank, to completely drive the French out of Spain and win the final useless battle at Toulouse, which was a bit of a bloodbath, but nevertheless one that he managed. It was a campaign that he manages to push very successfully. So Wellington is a much later developer with respect to Napoleon, even though they're born in the same year. Napoleon, of course, has huge numbers of victories, much bigger, larger geographical spread.
So he's Wellington.
Yes. And so I think Napoleon, most generals, I mean, like boxers, I'm going to beat him up. Of course I'm going to beat him up. So you can't go into a battle thinking you're not going to beat him up.
Yeah, so exactly. So he was just prepping his own mind.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And Napoleon's not wrong.
Yeah.
He's a good guy. And I think everybody agrees, all historians agree, that the French have basically won the battle until 7:30.
Now, one of the key elements of the Battle of Waterloo was this gap in trying to wait for the ground to dry out. It had been raining the previous night. Napoleon made the executive decision for the ground to give a few more hours for the ground to dry out before moving his artillery in. Now, was that opening of a few-hour window, was that a decisive moment in, well, let's just say Napoleon's failure then to actually clinch victory at Waterloo, because it gave time for the Prussians then to regroup and rejoin Wellington? So were those hours crucial, or could it have gone terribly wrong, of course, if the artillery did get bogged down in the mud?
Yeah, well, basically why they're waiting for the ground to dry out is because cannonballs will bounce. And when you want them to bounce,
to break legs.
They kill many more people when they bounce. So if the ground is wet, it just goes and doesn't go anywhere. So that's kind of no point. Napoleon is also apparently not particularly well. He's also he's a bit poorly.
He's a chest cold.
Yeah, he's got a bit of a headache. I don't know, but he's not particularly well, and he does. So there's a mixture of strategy and perhaps people have accused him of lethargy as well. Anyway, so this morning they wait to launch the attack. Napoleon also thinks that Grouchy has driven the Prussians off to the east. So it's not that he doesn't think that by waiting he's going to allow the Prussians to come back. He thinks Grouchy's got it sorted.
So there's a communication breakdown, could one say? Did he not get the memo?
Well, certainly Grouchy doesn't get the memo.
Yeah.
And this has caused endless amounts of paper. Why did Grouchy not come back? Why did he not come to the sound of the cannon? Nobody really knows. Napoleon gave him firm instructions, deal with these Prussians.
Yes.
But the Prussians, they do the right thing by the final result. They pull left, they don't pull right.
Yes.
And that allows them, Grouchy goes on to beat the Prussians at Wavre, but crucially, the other side of the river at Wavre, these other Prussians manage to emerge through the woods. They go on a sort of long march throughout the morning of the 18th, and they emerge on the battlefield way earlier than the Duke of Wellington wanted them to arrive, because he wants to win the battle himself.
And he wants the glory.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But the Prussians arrive at 2:00, which is only just half an hour after the initial attack of the French infantry.
Yeah.
So Napoleon is being attacked from behind.
Yes.
So he's got to take some troops away to deal with these guys who are attacking him from behind.
Gotcha. And now, look, there's some incredible quotes that I've dug up, in the run up to our meeting today. But also, of course, this is the 200th anniversary of Napoleon's death. So we've all been getting a good dose of our history over the last few months. One witness gave a description of the scene in Waterloo, and he said, "The discharge of every gun was followed by the fall of men and horses like that of grass before a mower's scythe." Can you just briefly, you alluded to it there about the cannonballs, can you just maybe give a little overview about how battles were fought back in the 19th century, back in the early 19th century?
I think the detail that strikes me, I'm not a military historian, but certain details about First Empire warfare are quite staggering, shocking, extraordinary. The most staggering fact, I think, is that they walk into battle. Yeah. They only break into a trot. Because if you start running, you lose order. You lose the ranks disappear, and so they basically walk into gunfire. This is why the First World War is such a catastrophe, because they do what they did. They've been doing for the whole of the 19th century, and so the last final attack, the Middle Guard. This is like 7:00 in the evening. They're about to win. The French have already taken this farm in the centre of the ground at Waterloo, so they've taken control of the centre. The Allied troops are now on the ropes, and the French are now going to take it, and so they walk up to the Allied line, and then they form a square. Apparently,
that's right. They have these quadrilles,
exactly.
squares.
So this is after there's been these repeated cavalry attacks throughout the afternoon, where the British use the squares very, very effectively. So, but there's a moment where a regiment suddenly finds itself alongside this attack of the Middle Guard at 7:00 as the dusk is beginning to come, and they shoot into the side of these guys who are walking and then jogging towards, and it's, of course, carnage. Another staggering fact about Waterloo, there's only comparable to the death at Waterloo is the Somme. Really? They're comparable in terms of bloodshed. The 30,000 dead for 120,000 on the field, 130,000 on the field. So it's for an average First Empire battle, you can imagine that casualties are like around about 8%. There we're talking 25.
Really? Okay.
So when they have a big celebration of Waterloo in London, they also have a day of memory. It's like what a catastrophe, what a disaster, and that's why Peterloo is called Peterloo. It's not because Waterloo is synonymous with a victory; it's synonymous with carnage.
Yes,
and that's the point about Peterloo. It's carnage.
Gotcha. Okay, very interesting. Now the other thing that the famous quote, if I'm not misquoting it, from Wellington, saying that it had been a close run thing.
Yeah,
I think
that's a damn nice thing, he says, which I think is really nice, because nice in the sense, we used to use that word in the past, I mean, maybe 50 years ago, that nice to mean tight, a close run thing. They also say a close run thing as well, yes.
As a close run thing, Napoleon, obviously, once his carriage was stolen, was commandeered by the Prussian troops, he barely escaped with his life then. I mean, he could have been, I don't know, he could have been swept up or taken prisoner.
Well, the last they're called the carré sacré. There's a final
the
square.
Final Imperial Guard.
The Imperial Guard. They're finally thrown into they don't usually fight, and they have to fight at Waterloo, and they surround Napoleon and escort him off the battlefield. So he's not going to be captured.
And they fight to the death.
Yes, some of
They're
them
massacred.
do. Famously, yes. Some of them survive, but others. And then there's a débandade. There's a complete. The British launch the cavalry, and there's a shouts of huzzah, and everybody's running.
Yeah.
And this is in the dark as well. I mean, okay, darkness is probably coming on about, let's say, 10 o'clock.
But it's twilight.
So it's twilight.
Yeah.
So there's and the field is covered with dead horses and dead people, and you get what a horrible thing.
Indeed, there's another comment there, which is a guy who went on the 22nd of June, who went to the field at the Battle of Waterloo, and it's a Major W.E. Fry. Who said that the scene was too horrible to behold because people have been there perishing from hunger, thirst, or their untreated wounds. So, I mean,
absolutely.
there was no one in there, no medics to go in and help. It was just people lying in misery.
This is a standard First Empire battles. Leipzig is something. There are still corpses on the field a month later. It's a public health disaster.
Yes, and when we just to go back to the carriage. That's a public health disaster. What about Napoleon's wealth disaster? That in that carriage were Napoleon's diamonds, but that didn't bankrupt him. That wasn't.
Well, the diamonds are like petty cash.
Yes.
So you basically
it was his slush fund.
Well, then about slush fund. Basically, he's imagining that he's going to win.
Yes.
And then when he wins, where he's heading for Brussels. He's heading for the capital, which he will then take possession of the Low Countries and then renegotiate with the allies that are kind of surrounding him. He thinks he's got a chance.
Yes.
And so he needs money to set himself up in Brussels. So that's why the diamonds. That's why you campaign money. But all the money that he is head of state in France, and he also has his own domaine extraordinaire, which is his own kind of cash thing, which it doesn't come from the French state. It comes from things that he's won in military battles. Booty.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And that's what happens in war. You end up you get to take other people's money because you've won.
Whoever said all is fair in love and war? I never really got my head around.
Yeah, well,
that.
What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine.
Exactly. That definitely I've heard. I hear it on a regular basis in the house. But let's have a look here. Now, after his defeat, and we covered this the last time we met. Napoleon was exiled for a second time. On this occasion, he was sent to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. He died indeed in 1821 in St. Helena, hence the 200-year commemorations. Looking back, though, at the Battle of Waterloo, we talked about the human cost there of the tens of thousands that were killed on the battlefield. But were there any positives to come out of Waterloo?
Well, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, it depends. In Britain, we tend to think of Waterloo as a victory. When I did research on this, it turns out that it's a bittersweet victory. As we said, major loss of life. There are no really major monuments to the victory of Waterloo. There's only one. It's in Edinburgh. It's called the Playfair Monument, which is a sort of Greek temple, which was never finished. So there are some Wellington columns in Ireland, as I think you'll know, in various places. There's a very small Waterloo column in Waterloo Place in London, but there was the Waterloo Arch happened during the 1850s.
Yes.
I mean, it took ages for that to be created and was kind of like commandeered by a sort of a putsch by a committee in the 1850s to make it in favour of Wellington. And it got moved. It was going to be the entrance arch to Buckingham Palace, which was still not finished in the 1820s, and then they moved it up to Hyde Park Corner. The medal, they were going to give a medal for all the victors of Waterloo. So this was going through the government, 1816, 1817, and then hang on, the army said, hang on, you guys have done how many months did you do on your campaign for Waterloo? 4 months. What about us? We were in Spain from 1808 to 1814. What do we get? Yes. If you're going to get a medal for that, what do we get? So there's big discussions. Not until 1836, it's like 20 years later, that they finally get the Joint Campaign Medal. So they can't even decide to have a medal for the soldiers who fought at Waterloo. And then again, when the Liberals take hold of the idea of Waterloo, they think of it as a carnage, and that's why Peterloo is called Peterloo. Now,
looking at the aftermath of Waterloo, but I mean, even in the grand scheme of things, I mean, the Congress of Vienna's role in, as you mentioned at the outset, they were all meeting in Vienna for months and months and months, and it was all apparently quite a carnival, and it was a real like spectator sport of who'd be at what ball.
Indeed, many balls, many dances.
Yeah,
indeed.
many balls, many dances, and lots of political intrigue and all
Yes.
that. But the one thing is, after Waterloo, one of the positives one could say is that it ushered in a period of relative peace for a Europe that had been ripping itself apart for decades in the run-up to Waterloo. But it also set the ground and set the terrain for the animosities that created World War I. So what do you think, that was Waterloo itself a decisive battle in ushering in this era of peace, or was it already a given now that the Congress of Vienna had set out how Europe was going to look over the next 50 years?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. Yes, I think these days, we've just gone through the bicentenary of the Congress of Vienna, and depending on the political colour of the historian writing, you will find people saying what you've just said, that yes, 50 years of peace. If you go a little bit to the left of centre and looking at the Congress of Vienna, which is a traditional liberal interpretation of the Congress of Vienna, it's the dead hand of the Ancien Regime coming back and stifling Europe until the revolutions of 1840, 1848. And let's say the creation of the Republic of Italy,
and
Balfour
and Garibaldi.
Yes, exactly. So this idea that somehow the French Revolution has taken a major hit by the recreation of this old Ancien Regime Europe.
So is entrenched essentially the hegemony of the aristocracy in keeping the political strings well in their grasp.
Well, if you look out, you only have to look at Austria. I mean, Austria is that.
Yes.
And Austria, we forget Prussia's a minor player. Austria is the big player.
The big guy.
Austria is the big guy, and Russia is the coming up big guy. Only does Prussia, once it unifies itself after the Battle of Sedan, it claims its own unity in Paris, in Versailles, of course. Famously, we've had the bicentenary, this 150th of that this year, last year as well. So yes, there's a sense that this old-fashioned, old-world kings, nobles, all the things that Napoleon kind of tried to
redefine,
play with. He's not actually, he's quite Ancien Regime himself, but he does carry on talking about having a republic, sort of. It's an empire, but it's a kind of republican empire in kind of ways. There's still the possibility that you couldn't possibly get a job without being the son of the noble.
That was it.
Certainly in Italy, that's in the parts of the empire further out, they still believe that. Yeah. And so with the return of the kings in the little states in Italy, the return of this extra super high-powered Ancien Regime in Naples, they see that as a backward step. So it depends what you come from. But it's true, there are no major wars, let's say.
Until Crimea, I think, would be the next
Crimea
one.
would be the first one, of course, which is the fault line, of course, is Russia.
Yeah.
Russia, as it rises in power and asserts itself. And there we have the oddness of France and Britain fighting together. A beautiful quotation of the twin leaders of the joint army in the Crimea. The old general, the British man, he had fought in Spain. And so whenever he referred to the enemy, to his French colleague, he referred to them as the French. Because he couldn't imagine anybody else who would be the enemy.
Of course. That is a fantastic way to finish our conversation today. I mean, it's a fascinating subject. Peter Hicks, thank you very much for joining me again today here on Power
Absolutely delighted, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for watching.